Thank you all for joining us for our second panel. In the first panel, we talked about what happened. In this panel, we're going to talk about what's next, dealing with some of the policy implications, some of how we begin to push that policy, what is the formula that's going to make that work, and some recommendations from our panel. First, to my immediate right, we have Indivar Dutta-Gupta, who's with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Jacqueline, who's with NCAI, Jeff Cruz with Latinos for Secure Retirement, Algernon with Economic Policy Institute, and Janis Bowdler with the National Council of Raza. Each of them will be given 3 minutes since there are more panelists, and I know that they are up to the task. Otherwise, our timekeeper in the front row will attack them. And then we will have the same amount of time for an engagement between the panel, as well as 20 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. Indy, please, if you wouldn't mind going first, and then we'll proceed to the right.
Thank you, Jeff, Anand, Maya, and all who made this event possible. We're facing a perfect storm of fiscal issues that make significant deficit reduction likely to be enacted soon, with a relatively short window for us to influence key decisions that might have consequences for generations to come. The president's re-election with a somewhat more progressive Congress means that many of the worst structural changes to social programs, like voucherizing Medicare or block granting SNAP and Medicaid, likely are not big threats for now, but nearly everything we care about remains at risk of harmful changes and damaging cuts. Now, some quick context for the coming fiscal debate. First, some budget watchers are urging policymakers to enact $4 trillion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years, but there's nothing magical about that number. In fact, policymakers could achieve the most essential fiscal goal of stabilizing our public debt as a percent of GDP, making sure our debt doesn't grow faster than the economy, by enacting about half that, $2 trillion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years. Second, the current Congress already has cut discretionary or annually appropriated funding by $1.5 trillion over 10 years, yet the fiscal debate today routinely overlooks the fact that the first stage of large-scale deficit reduction is already in law. These cuts will shrink non-defense discretionary funding, which includes an array of domestic programs, ranging from federal aid for high-poverty schools and Pell Grants for low-income students to Head Start and child care assistance, to its lowest level on record as a percent of GDP. Third, while the deficit reduction plan that Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson from the President's Fiscal Commission issued, and is the focus of many bipartisan budget conversations, has many troubling features, the plan actually would raise significant revenues compared to what policymakers are now proposing. When looked at over 10 years, this Bowles-Simpson plan, as it's called, would have $5.5 trillion in policy savings compared to current policies, including about 53% or $2.9 trillion from program cuts and 47% coming from revenues, about $2.6 trillion, nearly a 1-to-1 ratio. Policymakers already have enacted about half of the program cuts, but have not enacted any of the revenue increases. Policymakers who indicate their support for Bowles-Simpson's often have no idea what's actually in the plan. Keeping all this in mind, policymakers are confronting a perfect storm of fiscal issues that might make a longer-term deficit reduction agreement more likely. First, the Bush-era tax cuts and the Obama-era working family tax cuts, as well as temporary patches for the alternative minimum tax and Medicare physicians payments and emergency unemployment insurance benefits all expire at the end of December. The big fight is, of course, over the tax cuts for the highest incomes. But in fact, we've never before allowed emergency unemployment insurance benefits to expire with the unemployment rate this high. Secondly, sequestration, the roughly across-the-board automatic budget cuts triggered by the failure of the so-called super committee in Congress, begins in January. Sequestration is unquestionably poor and harmful policy. That, of course, was the whole point of it, to get policymakers to come to a better agreement. But many proposals to delay or cancel sequestration would actually result in even deeper cuts to non-defense programs. And fortunately, some key programs, including Social Security, Medicaid, and working family tax credits like the EITC and American Opportunity Tax Credit, are exempt, but non-defense discretionary spending is not. Third, by late February or early March, we'll need to raise the artificial debt limit, which Congress is likely to hit sooner, but Treasury will take extraordinary measures to extend. The last time we hit this debt limit, last fall, became a hostage-taking situation, with $1 of budget cuts demanded for every dollar the debt limit was increased. This simply cannot be allowed to happen again. And finally, by the end of next March, we'll need to enact appropriations legislation to keep the federal government from shutting down. So with all that good news, I'll turn it over.
Great. Thank you, and I'd really like to thank the Insight Center for hosting this event. I think this is a great discussion, perfectly timed after the election, not just about policy ideas we need, but really focusing on how to mobilize our electoral and political advocacy power to get these ideas implemented. I like to stick with what I know, so I'm going to focus on seniors, safety net programs, and pension savings. In fact, the Latinos for Secure Retirement coalition of 10 groups was formed specifically to give Latinos a voice on these issues. First of all, the average American will spend about 20% of their lifetime in retirement, retiring at the age of 63 and living to 78. Now, of course, Latinos live about 3 years longer on average. Women significantly outlive men. African Americans tend to live less longer than other groups. And of course, there's huge variance for individuals within these groups. So where do assets for seniors come from? Unfortunately, minorities frequently rely on safety net programs. The most kind of critical is Social Security. It's the foundation of retirement security. And to me, it kind of really represents a promise that if you work hard your whole life and play by the rules, you'll be protected if you can't work because of age and disability. It's more than just a seniors program. Through the disability, it protects working age people like myself if I get injured, fall down the stairs. And for people who have children, through the survivor's benefit, it protects orphans. Should something unfortunately happen to you, your child will be provided for. For Hispanics in particular, it's extremely critical. About half of Hispanics rely on it for 90% or more of their income, basically all their income. 40% of married Hispanic elderly, 63% of single elderly. The benefit's very, very modest. The average benefit for a Latino man senior was about $12,800. For Latino women, it was $9,600. Under $10,000 a year, and that's what these folks, the majority, are living off of. So we're very concerned about cuts to benefits. We released a plan, and it's out on the table with experts of color. So that has all the statistics. I'm limited on time. I really encourage people to look at it. And our kind of recommendations was to strengthen benefits. We're very concerned about a deficit deal that could potentially cut Social Security. Latinos came out, and the other panel talked about how we're critical in this election. We want the President and Congress to focus on immigration reform. We know the budget needs to be balanced, but we think it should be balanced by having the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share, and we're absolutely going to oppose any effort to balance the budget on the backs of the poor, the seniors, and on our communities. In particular, the chain CPI benefit cut, that's a change in the formula for the COLA, the cost of living adjustment, is our probably #1 concern right now, politically most likely to come out of the compromise. Not only would that be devastating for Social Security beneficiaries, it would in particular affect SSI, which is a Supplemental Security Income Program, because it's cumulative. So if you lower inflation, that begins the demise of the program, over 40, 50 years, as it has a lower rate of inflation. It's pretty much the death of the program long term. SSI, real quickly, there's 8 million recipients, absolutely critical for low income. I don't have data by race, but 1 out of 3 applicants, according to SSA, has a primary language other than English, with the vast majority of those being Spanish, so clearly it's critical for Latinos. It just celebrated its 40th anniversary after being signed into law by that liberal Richard Nixon. There's a lot of updates to the program that's needed. We have a whole list of 10 recommendations for the program that's out in front, and a press release we put out the other week. You guys can take a look, and if we want to talk about that more during question and answer. We think in SSI in particular, now is the time to improve the program. As people talk about the need to protect low income as they talk about reforms to Social Security, and especially with the wave of progressive senators being elected. A lot of people don't know this, but Elizabeth Warren, for example, focused on the rising bankruptcies among middle-class seniors, you know, many years ago before she was appointed to the Consumer Financial Protection Board.
Thank you, Jeff.
Finally, could I just...
You already went over 2 minutes. No, we'll definitely come back to you. So please hold that thought, and Jacqueline, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you. I'm Jacqueline Payton with the National Congress of American Indians, and this panel is, of course, supposed to be about our observations in the new environment. And my observation is the new environment looks really a lot like the old environment. You know, we have a lot of the same things: a divided government. We've heard all about those things: American people's lack of confidence in the government system, and of course, we have these economic challenges. All right. So most of the thing I think we learned as moving forward in the policy agenda is that it's the moderate centers who are really going to drive the agenda, and for Indian country, that makes it good. It's good for us. We have, you know, a history of Native vote making a difference in elections like Lisa Murkowski, and of course this election with Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, and so what that tells me, just from the last panel, what we all learned, of course, collaboration in organizations and groups like this is going to be essential, and collaboration about our policy messages and where we want to move forward with those policy messages. So my question to you guys is, when you're thinking about those things, think about that question: where do tribal governments sit? And how does this apply to tribal governments? Because so many times that's not on the forefront, and it's usually in the afterthought of how we include that. And that is on tax reform, it's on public sector jobs, it's on public policy and education. So for example, on tax reform, which we know is going to be a major policy issue being debated, tribal governments don't have the same consideration as other governments for things like tax-exempt bond financing that actually can help stimulate our economies, for pension plans, so that the tribal governments actually have to decide, is this employee an essential governmental employee, or is this an employee that actually might be part of my business sector? And then I have to have two pension plan policies. So there's a lot of things that are really affecting our economic growth because by not being included in those conversations. And even programs that stimulated jobs, like through the recovery, so many of those job programs didn't include tribal governments or eligible tribal members to be participate or to be able to get benefit of those job initiatives. So that's important for us. We think about the budget. Of course, everybody's thinking about the budget right now. That's the biggest policy frame that we're all looking at. But for us, there's a little bit more to it than that. We're looking at it not just from protecting the trust relationship that we have with treaties that give us these the financial responsibilities to tribes, but also the other protections that are part of that, like violence against women, which we're still hoping will be part of the lame duck strategy. And of course, the other essential governmental functions that are critical with budget implications is broadband build-out. What does that do for our economies in our rural and remote areas? And then, of course, the education policies that I think that we'll all be facing as we look at how do we come up with the next reauthorization of education policy? And clearly for us, what does that mean for Indian country? So just wanted to, my time is up. I did it right in the 3 minutes. I get a brownie point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Algernon, please.
Excellent. So we're here because we're interested in building wealth for communities of color. And my message is simple. When you have high unemployment, it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to build wealth in communities of color. When people are unemployed, they tend to draw down their wealth or go into debt. You know, how do you pay for your car if you don't have a job? How do you pay your rent if you don't have a job? How do you pay your mortgage if you don't have a job? How do you support your child going to college if you don't have a job? So if you don't have a job, you're going to be drawing down whatever savings you have. Once the savings are gone, you're paying your bills with your credit card. When your credit cards are maxed out, you're going to your friends and relatives for loans, and you're drawing down their wealth. So simply put, high unemployment destroys wealth in communities. So So if we want to build wealth in communities, we need to strive for an unemployment rate of 4% or less, ideally less. But certainly we don't want to get much higher than 4%. In 2007, the white unemployment rate was 4.1%. In 2006, it was 4%. In 2005, it was 4.4%. So an unemployment rate of 4% or less is something that's achievable. It's not something that's pie in the sky. Last month, however, the white unemployment rate was 7%, significantly higher than the 4% ideal. The Hispanic rate was 10%, higher still. The black rate was 14.3%, even further from the ideal. We need about 9 million jobs to get us back to where we were at the start of the recession in 2007. But even then, the unemployment rates for Hispanics, for African Americans, for Native Americans were much higher than average. To bring those groups down to where whites were would require another about another 1.5 million jobs. So in my view, we're really short about 10.5, 11 million jobs. By any measure, that's a crisis. Unfortunately, the signal from President Obama is that this is not on his agenda. In his victory speech, he identified his priorities, or it seemed like he identified his priorities, and they were reducing the deficit, reforming our tax code, fixing our immigration system, freeing ourselves from foreign oil. There was no mention of 9 to 11 million jobs shortfall. So this is a real problem because, again, how do you build wealth if you don't have a job, if you're drawing down your savings, if you're maxing out your credit card? In a weak economy like we have now, aggressive deficit reduction will cost jobs. It will put more people out of work. So what do we need to do? We need to push the president to put jobs on his agenda. It's really, for every demographic, it's the #1 issue. And his jobs agenda should include extending unemployment insurance, benefits to the long-term unemployed, repairing our nation's deteriorating infrastructure, and providing aid to state and local governments. And I'll say more about that later. Thank you.
So it's my job to wrap up and talk about housing, which for those of you that I know, or you know me, I'm usually talking about housing. I'm a housing wonk. And so in that context, I'll say housing is the most important issue that was not talked about in the elections. Now, my friends in climate change will call that a pretty audacious claim, but since I have speaker's prerogative, we're going to go with it for right now. So we heard in the last panel a lot about the demographic changes of our nation. Again, no secret to people in this room, but apparently a well-kept secret for others. That didn't just have political implications, it's also changing the face of our housing markets. For example, by 2020, half of all first-time homebuyers will be Latino homebuyers. Latinos, families of color, are changing the face of our housing market, which means that going into 2013, we need to tackle these issues and meet communities of color where they are. We really brought this issue to the forefront in 2012. I'm not going to go through all of the foreclosure statistics. These are things that are well known, I think, in this room. But maybe not as well known is the amount of work that we did to try to really get it on the agenda. NCLR worked in partnership with several of the groups in this room, Opportunity Agenda, Urban League, National Capacity, to deliver 40,000 signatures to both presidential candidates, asking them to take on this issue. And again, the fact that we didn't hear a squeak about it is a real problem. It doesn't mean that the problem has gone away. You simply cannot fix our economy without addressing housing, and you can't heal the housing market without talking about what's going on in our communities. So let me just quickly lay out 2 areas that should be housing priorities for the administration and for Congress going into 2013. I'll go short on details, but happy to go in more depth in our Q&A. The first is probably the most obvious, which is we're still roiled by foreclosures, and this is a significant problem in communities of color in particular. And while the political appetite to deal with this issue has really waned, it is no less a problem. Also, because of the budget issues we've already heard a lot about, we're not likely to see new money on this. So the strategy needs to be to look at accountability for the major settlements that we saw in 2012. Department of Justice and Tom Perez in particular in the Civil Rights Division deserves a lot of credit for what they accomplished. But we need to make sure that families who are due benefits under those settlements or relief under those settlements actually get them. And then the second major policy issue that we're going to have to address in 2013 with significant impact for communities of color is overhauling our housing finance system. In shorthand, that means what are we going to do about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who are still in conservatorship. But the name of the game is really all about access. In 2010, we were successful in getting Dodd-Frank, which is going to put a lot of consumer protections, but really we all know that Wall Street controls the money, and in housing finance reform, that's what it's all about. How are we going to make sure that capital that is available on Wall Street actually makes it into our communities in the form of mortgages? A lot of details there, but I'll cover that in Q&A.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure that the audience has ample time because clearly we didn't during the last session. And so I'm going to ask one question and then open the floor to the audience. I have a list. If you don't have any, I'm more than willing to continue to ask them, but want to make sure that the audience has time. And this kind of broadly speaks to where all of you are in dealing with the wealth gap. In this last election, there was little to no conversation about the working poor. And I don't think that there's any shortage of the issue on the issues that you all discussed having at least some congressional allies. But when even those congressional allies have a difficult time framing the policy needs for the working poor versus the policy needs for the middle class, how do we begin to move from some of these very needed policy areas that you've discussed to legitimate movement around those policy areas? And whether it's multi-demographic movements or whether it's single demographic movements, do you see us on the front end of that going into 2013? Or is there more institutional work that has to be done in order for it to be real? And anyone can take that.
I'll start, and I'm sure other people will join in. But just first of all, for our community, this is probably one of our weakest areas. And I hate to say that. You know, this whole thing is about unemployment in Indian country is the highest in the nation, and systemically been the highest for generations. I think that's why it's most difficult, is because the lack of hope and solutions to be able to address this issue. And so as we try to rally what are our policy recommendations, we really need to have larger coalitions working together on things that can really get done and get put forward. The job components that were put forward in the ARA were very short time kinds of jobs. And so we don't have long-term solutions. And if we leave it up to Congress to come up with their proposals, once again, we're going to see that very, very, hit the fan short term, and we've got to have some longer-term recommendations.
Indy, please.
I'd make 2 points. One is that a lot of people who are in poverty or near poverty, contrary to what I think the public perception is, are working. And they're trying to work if they're not working. And they have worked if they're not working now, and they will work again. So that's the first thing. And I don't think that really is how people think of this issue. And that's something we have to hammer home. You take a program like SNAP, formerly food stamps, an increasing share of people who benefit from SNAP are working, right? If you're getting unemployment insurance, you necessarily work. You couldn't get it otherwise. The same is true for Social Security. You or someone in your household worked for you to benefit from it. So I think that's important. The other thing is that the fates of earnings, I think, and Algernon would be more of an expert here, for more middle wage, middle earner, middle income workers is very much tied, I think, to what happens to workers below them on the wage scale. You're not going to see wages go up for the middle even or bid up at all unless you have very low unemployment, which of course will help people, especially who are unemployed, right? But I think people don't see those connections. But why would employers suddenly start bidding up wages for somebody in the middle with middle wages if there's millions of people unemployed who could replace them, right? So seeking out a full employment agenda and making sure that both advocates, activists, but also policymakers understand how much people's fates are intertwined here, I think is really essential.
Yeah, and if I could follow up, I mean, yes, absolutely. When you have a tight labor market, that leads to competition among employers to, in terms of bidding up wages. So you will end up with smaller numbers of working poor. So, I mean, it's actually a very big question that you asked. There are a number of components that would go into producing full employment, producing tight labor markets. One thing that I and some other scholars have been talking about is public sector jobs. I mean, during the Great Depression, and at certain other times in American history, the government has really stepped in and put people to work. And we have to recognize, you know, as Jackie just mentioned, that there are lots of communities where they're in a depression, they have been in a depression for an extended period of time. And I mean that there are communities, you know, you can look at right here in Southeast DC where the unemployment rate is 20%, you know, and that's normal. So for these communities, I've suggested that the private sector is not stepping in. They haven't stepped in for 4 decades or more. For these communities, the public sector needs to step in like we did during the Great Depression and create public sector jobs, create jobs in rehabilitating, addressing both the physical and human infrastructure needs in these communities with the members of the communities. So those are some ideas to help produce tight labor markets that lifts the wages for workers broadly, like Indy mentioned.
Thank you, Janis, and then Jeff.
Yeah, so Indy, I really appreciate you pointing out that a lot of poor families are in fact working families or trying to find work. The Hispanic comedian George Lopez joked that the recession was hitting his friend really hard. He was down to only 3 jobs. And that is the experience in the community. But I think the other thing that the recession has done is has meant that a greater number of people are now relying on social safety nets or have had to tap that. And so going to some of the conversation from the last panel, this means that people have a different understanding and have had a different experience about the role of government in their lives. It was easy when that was somebody else. It's different when all of a sudden you were that person who lost the job and needed unemployment insurance and can now look at it differently. And so I also agree with Jacqueline that we need to build a broader coalition here to now capitalize on that. But I think it's ripe to be able to explain that there is a positive and productive role for the government in making sure that these basic safety nets are there. And that's a more meaningful conversation now for a wider swath of families than maybe before the recession.
You know, we had record numbers of Latinos vote last election. 12 million in key battleground states. So, you know, we're starting to flex our political muscle. At the same time, and this was touched upon in the last panel, only about half of eligible Latinos voted. So out of 6 Latinos, only 3 would vote in a presidential. That number becomes 2 out of 6 for midterms. If you look at African Americans and whites, 4 out of 6 vote in presidential and half vote in midterms. So out of every 6 people, the Latino community is losing 1 vote. Altogether, that's 4 million more votes we could have if we voted at the same rate as African American and whites. So, you know, as well as we did last election, there's just such a huge amount of opportunity to mobilize the Latino community more. That's going to involve more resources, groups like NCLR and others. We're very active in turning out the Latino community. But when you look at the votes it makes sense to farther mobilize those resources for our community. The other thing I want to just point out is that there's also a big lack of Latinos among key policy positions in D.C. I think we need more Latinos at agencies like SSA, Department of Labor. We need more Latinos working on the Hill. And frankly, we need more Latinos at events like this and working with all across the board, both specifically for Latino organizations and also for, lack of a better word, mainstream organizations.
Great, thank you very much. I want to give you all the opportunity to have a robust discussion with this panel. And so, yes, please.
Hi, everybody. I was the lady in pink in the back, and now I'm the lady in front in black. Okay. So Lisa Hasegawa again with National Capacity, and I just wanted to share a couple of additional.
And let me make this clear so that this doesn't set a precedent.
Oh, yes.
This was prearranged, so please don't believe that you will be able to do the same thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to just echo some of the things that Christine had said earlier, and then also we've been working very closely, National Capacity has, with NCLR and the Urban League on a lot of policy agenda items and also with Insight, so appreciate being here. Just really quickly, the poll results, we did poll on a lot of policy issues, opinions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on policy issues, and we have those handouts. Many of you may not have got it when you walked in, but we do have those, and it's all on our website. But surprisingly to us, Asian Americans, were very supportive of the social safety net. So echoing a lot of what you guys have already said. We work as National Capacity with low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, and we've always been dogged by this perception of Asian Americans being split, both economically, being very wealthy, and also very poor in terms of new immigrants, and also split politically, half Republican, half, so therefore not really worth a lot of investment. And so I think that what was surprising for us, and I guess the silver lining in this election, in terms of the results, in terms of the economic downturn, I think the silver lining for us is that there is clearly an opinion and a feeling in our community that aligns very much with other communities of color, and I think that we haven't always seen that, and we're always sort of the split and the quote-unquote model minority. And so I think that the results from this poll, in terms of just some quick stats, over 70% of Asian Americans supported increasing taxes on the wealthy, over the same kinds of percentages in terms of support for healthcare reform, affordable housing, and also more favorable opinions of the president for his actions around the deferred action. So those were all very positive in terms of alignment with other communities of color in a lot of these coalitions. So we thought that that was really great. Just echoing and restating what Christine had said earlier, we're growing very quickly in Ohio, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, Nevada. That sounds like many of the very important states. So I think in terms of APIs, they lost 54% of their wealth between 2005 and 2009. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in poverty between 2007 and 2011 increased by 40%, which was really shocking because I think the rate of poverty in our community, it looks like it decreased slightly, but that's because we're such a fast-growing population. But the poverty population increasing by 40%, it means a lot for social service providers and a huge impact in terms of their ability to meet the growing needs in our community. So I just wanted to give a little bit of detail on sort of the opinions and sort of my thoughts on where the alignments are and the opportunities are in terms of policy work, mobilizing our communities, educating them on policy issues, and then also in terms of investments and partnerships with federal government. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Seems to me that the conceptual framework that created as well as keeps in place the wealth divide in this country is the concept that taxes will kill the economy. And it seems to me that that concept is a myth, given that until 1961, 90%, we had a 90% tax rate, which meant that about that 90 cents of every dollar after 300,000 or so of income went to the federal government.
And so your question?
Why do we allow that concept to remain in place on a stranglehold when all the evidence is that it's untrue, and given that the myth that the government spending money kills the economy, when 90 cents of every dollar spent by the government is for personnel, and that creates demand because people buy materials and goods.
Thank you so much. Anyone? Indy?
Well, we shouldn't. I mean, we shouldn't let that myth continue to go onward. One of the worst private sector job creation records was from 2000 to 2008. You had over 22 million net jobs created during the Clinton years after a significant tax increase in 1993. So I mean, that fight's not over. That's exactly where I think we need to remind ourselves what some of the folks on the panel earlier said. Sometimes we don't even realize when we're winning. And we might actually be winning on some of this stuff. Yeah. And so we need to appreciate that and run with that. I
want to add to that. It's messaging, I think. We have not come together to be able to come up with some common sense messaging that's simple so that our people don't just like, ooh, taxes, you know, and don't want to talk about it and don't understand it. And so then, you know, we steer away from that. It gets into this whole lack of even going into like financial education in our communities, being able to message that right. And earlier the conversation was about the 99%ers. Once again, the sustainability of that kind of message, people taking ownership for the personal responsibility, and how do we sustain that kind of message that gets to your point of how do we turn around the education piece of this? We've got to message it right.
But Janis, let me ask you as a follow-up. Clearly, there seem to be several lanes that aren't connecting. And so we don't have an absence of scholars working on the policy work. We don't have an absence of lawmakers who are willing to support the policy. But at what point does what Jackie said take place where you've got policymakers, whether it's in organizations like yours that have policy wings and activism wings, that are really creating more sophisticated strategy, connecting with messaging organisms that really begin to bubble up movement? Because again, that's what we're talking about, right? How do we connect the policy stuff that you all are talking about with legitimately sustainable movement to push that policy forward?
Well, I agree with a couple of the comments that have been made. I mean, dare we say it, but we're winning, and we should act like it. I mean, we just reelected a president with an economic platform that, at least as laid it out, is something that we can agree with. We've got to hold his feet to the fire. So I think we've got the puzzle pieces. We've got to put them together. I actually think we've got a lot of good messages. What we don't have, and I think that last piece to really pull it together, is what is our microphone? What is our platform? And so somebody mentioned this in the first panel, and I'm sorry I forget who, but we have to take our civic engagement infrastructure that worked so hard to first register and then mobilize the vote and now keep them engaged in the off-year cycle. And that is going to be our final ingredient. And if we can do that, then I think we can really win on the issue. So if we can get that megaphone, I think communication strategy is going to be critical, then we can actually win. And let me just say that I think the message here that really works for our community, that they understand, is one that the Insight Center and Closing the Racial Wealth Gap has really helped to put together, which is this country has a long history of investing in wealth escalators. Whether it was creating FHA, the GI Bill, we have helped pave the way for middle class for millions of Americans. We have to continue doing that. The generation now benefits by investing in the generation that's coming up behind it, and now is not the time to turn our back on that kind of commitment. Our communities really understand that. We just need more channels to get that message out there.
Algernon, as you respond to that, can you also deal with the issue that within this Obama administration, it's been addressed on more than one occasion in this room, that there's a feeling in some cases that African-American issues are on ice? Whether that's true or not, how do we begin to thaw the environment? Right. And to some of Janis's points, how pragmatically do we begin to do that?
I first want to go back.
No, please.
Before I
as the only black guy on the panel, I just had to ask you.
I want to go back before I address that. Yeah, so just the sort of prior two issues, I mean, I'm really happy to, Lisa, I wasn't aware of this survey. I'm really happy that I found it and have it available. But one thing that Lisa did not mention when asked what's the most important issues facing the Asian American community, the #1 issue was fix the economy / create more jobs, So again, when I mentioned every demographic, identifies creating more jobs as the #1 issue. I meant that literally, every demographic. In terms of one of the issues that we need to hold the White House to is the #1 issue of the people who put him back in office, which is create more jobs. Going back to the issue of taxes, and the gentleman referred to the importance of the public, of the government employing people. Since February of 2010, the public sector has lost about 500,000 jobs, while the private sector has gained 5 million jobs. The public sector has been crucial to the black middle class, and the blacks and the black middle class has been losing disproportionately of the decline in the public sector. So again, when we're thinking about creating wealth for communities of color, we have to be paying attention to this decline in public sector jobs. That's the decline of the black middle class. That's the decline of black wealth. It's also important for other groups. I mean, Hispanics are growing in the public sector, but if we have a shrinking public sector, the Hispanic numbers in the public sector won't grow as much as it can grow if we allow national politics to drastically reduce the public sector employment. So the president and African Americans, I'm actually, there are two sides. I do think that some of the criticism has been or I think the administration has done things that has benefited African Americans that they haven't gotten credit for. So within the Recovery Act, there was support for state and local governments. So that was good, and we need more of it because there's still a need there. In the Recovery Act, there are a number of provisions: expansion of earned income tax credit, child tax credit, aid to social people. $250 for people on Social Security, other things, infrastructure investments well, there are a whole a whole range of things that benefited communities of color. They didn't say this is for communities of color, but they did have positive benefit. On the other hand, I do think that the administration has been quite timid. And they have not gone as far as I think that they could in terms of addressing the needs of communities of color. So that's true. And in terms of practice, I do think, I think unfortunately, and I'm saying this as a scholar and a researcher, I think that we may have maybe too much research on our side, whereas on the other side, there's a lack of any research. I mean, they think that the white electorate is going to grow because there's no one actually looking at the data. They're just messaging. And we're looking at the data and not doing enough messaging. So there needs to be a little bit of balance on that, I think.
No, Greg. Janis, I want to come back to you, but I want to get another question before we do. Yes, sir, in the back.
What are some ways that you think we can bridge the wealth inequality gap without necessarily leaning on Washington so much?
Andy?
I'll just say quickly from everything that I've read, a lot has to happen in public schools and education, and that is somewhere where obviously Washington can matter. I talked about federal aid to high poverty schools through Title I, and there's other programs, but a lot of that work is going to have to be done locally and at the state level. Parental education, graduating from high school, as a lot of folks here know, is a very good predictor of how well children will do later in life. And I think that's an area where, in fact, the first focus probably is going to need to be at the local and state level.
But to his point, are there any best case scenarios or replicable models that you're seeing where there is even public, private, nonprofit sector kind of strategies that are beginning to see job growth created as a result of accepting responsibility for the multiple factors that are needed? You're laughing, Jeff.
Well, I thought I had a good answer, and then you kind of
and then I messed it up.
Well,
give me the better answer you had before I messed up the question.
You know, I think, you know, for most middle-class Americans, you know, their largest assets are their house and their private pension savings. But among Latinos, you know, less than a third of Latinos participate in an employer-offered pension plan. 55%, over half of white Americans do. And so, you know, we see a tremendous need to boost savings, you know, 401k savings, IRA, private pension savings among the Latino community. Something that industry has done a great job on is really promoting default options, where, you know, you'll be saving 5% or whatever in your pension to get your match. You still have the option to opt out, but the default is that you'll be in that. And we've seen disparities in TPS, which is the 401k-like plan for federal employers. You know, we've seen when they've gone to default, the disparities, racial disparities, has really shrunk. Now, you said the federal government. Outside of that, you know, one of the things we're pushing for is an automatic IRA, which, because a lot of Latinos work in small businesses or the informal economy or jobs where a pension isn't offered. But by giving an auto IRA, this would default them into saving. And the important thing is the way pensions are set up, that, you know, if you're in the highest income tax bracket, you have quite a big incentive to save money with the tax deferral. Or if you're in a low income bracket, you don't have the same incentive. So the key part is extending the saver's tax credit to give low-income people an incentive to save into their pension.
Thank you.
And we have a one sheet, too, with more details back there. I like one sheet.
Young lady in the gray had a question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal Leapart, and I'm a student at Howard University. And I had a question to the panel and the moderator, of course, if you want to chime in, just about talking points and things you think we should hit when we're doing lobby days on the Hill. I serve as president of my chapter of the NAACP, and with our student association, we do lobby days on the Hill. And it's pretty, I guess, I get a little bit easier to come up with health points and education points, but the talking points when covering, you know, the whole multicultural aspect of it is a little bit difficult to come up with. So if you guys could give me some advice about what we can be doing while we're hitting Congress and hitting, you know, the different offices here in D.C., that would be great. Thank you.
Anyone? Janis?
Well, that's I think a tough question to put it all in one place, but I think a lot of the resources that are in the back of the room are a good place to start. But let me see if I can draw across some of the threads, draw together some of the threads we've heard. As Algernon said, across all demographics, economy and jobs is the #1 issue. Also, in all the election eve or exit polls, communities of color stand firmly on the side of the president in terms of raising revenues and asking the wealthiest to pay their fair share of taxes. If we can get those two things going, then we create a lot of space to work on all the other issues that we really care about. One other thing that I think is an important distinction in this conversation, and this was kind of my just sticking with me through the first panel discussion, is there was a lot of talk about progressive politics and our movement towards progressive politics, and progressive politics are winning right now. But I want to make sure, and actually, Jeff, your question from the first panel made me think of this, which is, what is the, I'm not going to get the question exactly right, but, you know, is there a problem with the fact that our electorate has swung so heavily into the Democratic base? And I think there is a problem with that, and this is something for you to keep in mind in your lobby visits, and that is that if the Republican Party writes us off and says our votes aren't gettable, that means they don't work for them. That means that some Democrats and some progressives turn around and look at us and say, where else are you going to go? So they don't work very hard on our issues. So balance is really important for us, and our community sticking to the issues and not to the parties is very critical. So that then this translates to your question of when you're going up to the Hill, making sure that you communicate that our votes are up for grabs, and just having just progressive politics is not enough to do it. A rising tide doesn't necessarily lift all boats. What we haven't seen the Progressive Platform do very well is talk about racial inequity specifically. And those should be part of your talking points as you go to the Hill.
I agree. You just have, there is such power that you have as young people. And I think that what the country is missing is angry college students who are, but who aren't unsophisticatedly angry, who are sophisticatedly angry, and who have a policy agenda that is not about one party or another, but when you come, they start shaking because Howard students are coming. And they know that Howard students have a clear agenda, and then you're developing those talking points not based on the president's talking points, or not based on the Democratic or Republican Party's talking points. They're based on what you all organically have created at Howard University and have a level of integrity to, based on the research and the partnerships that you've created with some of these. I mean, you all are at an unbelievably fantastic institution. And so the research that you need is all there. Utilize that research to be able to come out of the gate strong and aggressive, but with your agenda, and just be unapologetically, intellectually gangster with it. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Janis, I was wondering if you could dig a little deeper and share some of the specifics on your comments around overhauling the GSEs, because that's where most of the wealth is in terms of the minority wealth is in housing. So if you could.
I would love to. Thank you for asking that question. Saw me get all excited. But I will still try to do this briefly because this is my soapbox. You've already seen me get on a couple of them. I could go for a while. Right now, Fannie and Freddie are in conservatorship, and between Fannie, Freddie, and FHA, the U.S. government, and by extension taxpayers, are financing the vast majority of our loans and our mortgages in this country, over 90%. My good friend Jim Carr is in the audience, and I'm always hesitant to quote statistics when I know Jim is watching, because he knows them down to, I think, 2 percentage points out. But suffice to say, the vast majority of our mortgages. So the question is, that we know that this situation is unsustainable. Nobody wants to keep Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. So they need to be wound down, and something is going to be put in their place. Or they will be reconfigured, and they'll slap a new sticker on it. But in some way, shape, or form, they're going to kind of be reborn and come out as a different entity. There's a lot of different models out there that folks are debating, whether we have a single guarantor, whether we have a public utility model. But there's a couple of fundamental questions for this audience for us to zero in on. One is that whether or not the federal government should have any role in guaranteeing our mortgages. And the answer is yes, they absolutely should. Without the federal government putting a guarantee on mortgages, you lose things like the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. We would have short-term mortgages with variable interest rates. But the corollary to that is, if the federal government, and by extension all of us in the room, the taxpayer, are going to be on the hook for some of those mortgages, there's a benefit that flows to the industry. That benefit needs to be widely and accessibly available to all creditworthy families, no matter where you live. Now, industry is going to be very happy to take that government guarantee on the mortgages, really does not want to talk about equity and making sure that the benefits from that guarantee flow into all communities. And whether we like it or not, the private market by itself is not going to go into urban cores. It's not going to go into the colonias. It's not going to go into Appalachia. It's not going to reach all corners of the market. So really the debate for us coming up is, how do we make sure that as we restructure our mortgage, that it's done in a way that keeps the liquidity that has come to really finance and keep a stable housing market going, and done in a way that keeps capital flowing to communities that have traditionally been left out of the mainstream. That will be the critical the critical question. We've heard a couple of other really important debates kind of creep up, and I'll just mention this last one, and that's the idea of a wealth standard, that different regulations that are out there now would mandate a 20% down payment. That, I don't think I have to explain the math there. That locks out really our community. It would take communities of color 20 years, a family of color 20 years, to save for that kind of down payment. But just as importantly, it would take a white family 14 years. That's nothing to sneeze at. That dramatically reduces our pool of potential first-time home buyers and would dramatically shrink our housing market. It's not good policy for anybody. So those access and affordability questions are really at the heart of the debate, and we will see that starting to take center stage in 2013. First, I think administratively, probably not in Congress. First, between Secretary whoever replaces Secretary Geithner at Treasury, and Fannie and Freddie's regulator.
Thank you, Janis, and I won't tell anybody you planted that question. I want to get one. We only have time for about one more question, so I want to make sure. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the current state of wealth disparities, but I have a question regarding the next generation, and it relates to access to higher education. So we have the Supreme Court case coming up talking about race-based admission preferences. And I wanted to know what policy initiatives are potentially in the works to fill that gap that may be there, and to continue to allow minorities and underrepresented communities to have access to higher education.
Jackie? Yeah, don't hesitate. Just go for it.
Well, I was hesitating because I'm trying to think, okay, how does ours really go across the board? We actually have put forward in our, first of all, Native Americans' access to higher education is a big challenge for us, and we have substantially lower numbers than the other demographics do, of people going to college. But what we're really trying to do is to be able to make sure that the tax credits can be applied for jobs that are in our own community so that they can actually get some benefit from working, reinvesting back in their own community, working in the tribal government, for example, so they can actually get some relief from college debt, is one of the ways of being able to address that.
Let me do this because again I was told we had 2 minutes. I want to ask a question that speaks to the future piece, even if it doesn't speak to the access to education, because a lot of the discussion has still been around federal sector responsibility around job creation and opportunity housing to bridge the wealth gap. But I'm interested, Indy, if you could address where are the sectors that look like they can yield the greatest potential from a policy perspective that we need to be advocating for, that with the right kind of investment are looking at job creation in the next decade. So for instance, if it's renewable energy and the investment that needs to be made either by the federal or the private sector to be able to see renewable energy real and thus creating jobs, whether it's on the manufacturing side, the supply side, or otherwise. I haven't heard a lot of that from the panel. And so before we close, if we could talk a little bit, and if you're not the one to answer that, I got you. But I did want to talk about what are some future industries where you're going to see renewable energy policy coming up, and it may not have the numbers, but with the right kind of movement, it can. And if it's not that, what is the sector that yields the most potential for this next Congress?
Well, briefly, of course, one way or another, we're going to have to do something to address the climate problem. So I think you're right about renewable energy, but I want to add to that healthcare. So in the very, very long run, we have to control our healthcare costs somehow. And right now, we don't know the best ways to do that without harming beneficiaries and access to care or quality of coverage. And that is something that I think people from all sorts of different areas of expertise can contribute to, developing new models, testing things out. We'll see some of this under the Affordable Care Act. But when I say healthcare broadly is a field where I think there's already probably the fastest job creation we've seen, not always because it's very efficient, sometimes because it's inefficient, but that's an area where I think young people especially will have a lot of promise because there's just no way And this is actually a bigger problem in the private sector than public, to be clear. Public sector does a far better job controlling healthcare costs than does the private sector. But system-wide, our whole healthcare system is very inefficient, and we're not getting the results we should get for the amount we spend compared to other similarly wealthy countries. And I think that there's just lots of opportunities, whether you're going to study psychiatry or sociology or economics or business. There's lots of opportunity there in the coming decade and beyond.
I'm sorry, Jeff. I know I keep interrupting, but we're out of time. And so I don't want to be the moderator that keeps us going when I'm being told to stop. So I'd like to say thank you to Janis, to Algernon, to Jackie, to Jeff, and to Indy for their participation in this panel. Please give them a round of applause.